In the last class, we have looked into the parts of the hypothalamus and their functions of the hypothalamus and their functions. And we have looked into some part of the functions of the hypothalamus. Today, we will focus on the temperature regulation by the hypothalamus. What I am planning to do, or what I am planning to give my lectures in hypothalamus in the following forms. So it's a very vast area. Hypothalamus is a very vast area. That is why I have divided into small bits or small areas. In the sense, the endocrine regulation is one of the function of the hypothalamus. Then because it regulates almost all the endocrine organs excepting the parathyroid gland and to some extent the thymus. That is, the thymus is also a little bit doubtful because it is concerning with the immunity. The immunity is governed by some of the autonomic system. Okay, so now that is one aspect. Then that means the endocrine regulation. We dealt with the endocrine regulation in the last class as a part of the function. So then thermoregulation is another important aspect of the hypothalamus. Third is the physiology of feeding and satiety. That is another important homeostatic regulatory mechanism by the hypothalamus. Fourth is this is about the energy balance. Here is the water balance, water homeostasis. That is the thirst and posterior pituitary function. And then another homeostatic regulatory, cyclical regulatory mechanism is a sleep regulation, maintaining the daily wakefulness and non-wakeful states. Then regulation of the circadian rhythms, not only governing the diurnal variations, the ultradian variations. Then hypothalamus as a mouthpiece of the limbic system, or as an output of the limbic system, because all the limbic functions are associated with the hypothalamus. And eighth is autonomic regulation, autonomic system regulation by the hypothalamus. These are some 8, and of course there are some things like memory and learning which are associated with hypothalamus, which I will be dealing or I will be telling along with the limbic function. Okay, so practically I have enumerated 8 functions of the hypothalamus, and you can extend the functions further in these chapters. Today we concentrate on thermoregulation. What is thermoregulation? Let us define it. It's a mechanism in mammals or in the animal kingdom as such to maintain the body temperature in a closely controlled manner, no matter what happens around us. So it's a mechanism by which mammals maintain the body temperature in a tightly controlled manner, no matter what is the external environment temperature is. So it is a homeostatic process that provides a stable temperature for all the activities or the cellular activities, because all the cellular enzymatic activities are governed, or the optimum temperature for these enzymatic activities are is at our body temperature 37 degrees Celsius. So that we survive because of this homeostatic regulatory mechanism. Now, because if there is a change in the body temperature, then we will end up with a certain amount of or we will end up with the severe abnormalities, either in the cold severe hypothermia or hyperthermia. So the temperature range is maybe the 37 degrees is our normal body temperature, after 43 degrees Celsius, it is impossible to survive. Or if the temperature falls below 35 or 34, again it becomes a severe hypothermia. So that means in the narrow range it is maintained. Now, in the animal kingdom, there are two types of animals, one ectotherms and endotherms. Ectotherms are those animals who depend upon who maintain the body temperature from the external environment. That means they gain the heat and they will take the heat, and according to that they will try to live along. Endotherms are those animals which produce they have the heat generated or heat regulated within the body. That means within the body itself. That means they have an internal regulatory mechanism and they survive. No matter what is that external environment is about. Maybe we live in a very cold environment like in Himalayas, where the temperature is in minus below the freezing level, or we live in the desert of the Rajasthan where the temperatures 50 degrees or above. Why not Rajasthan? Even sitting in Chittoor itself, sometimes we reach up to 50 degrees Celsius and we maintain our body temperature at 37 degrees Celsius. So that means endothermic and ectotherms. The humans and other mammals and the birds are the endothermic animals. Okay, now let us consider these aspects. I have already said about endothermic animals and ectothermic animals. Now I have come with another two terms, the homeothermic and poikilothermic. The homeothermic animals are what are called warm-blooded animals. That means they control the body temperature. Homeotherm is a controlled temperature. A poikilotherm is an uncontrolled. That means the body temperature changes according to the environment, according to the external these things. Now in the homeothermic, we have endothermic. Endothermic means internal regulators. Endothermic is internal regulators, and the birds and the mammals are the homeothermic, endothermic animals. So these are homeothermic animals which are internally regulated. Okay, so now there are certain homeothermic animals who are controlled by the external means, the externally regulated. That means external environment regulates them. These include some of the tropical reptiles, dinosaurs, and the organisms in the deep sea or in the deep water, deep lakes. So these are fish. Some fish which are in the deep sea, they will have a temperature maintenance according to the local area or local regions. Okay, so now we have come back here in the poikilothermic animals. We loosely talk about a cold-blooded animals. That means they change according to the external things because they don't have the regulatory mechanisms. So in that there are some poikilothermic animals who have internal regulators, but these internal regulators are there to adjust to the external environment. So like that, some birds and mammals who go for hibernation for a period. So those regulate the body temperature by going into hibernation and suppressing their activity. And invertebrates and insects belong to this category because they can change the temperature to any level. So you have the cockroaches either in a cold environment or in a hot environment, and they are there. They are as active as that. So these insects and invertebrates, they are there. Not all invertebrates, some invertebrates, but all insects there. Now coming back with the poikilothermic and ectothermic animals. Poikilothermic, ectothermic. What I'm talking about, poikilothermic means they are not regulated or they are not controlled, and ectothermic means controlled by the external environment. The most of the fish, that means the most of the fish, they are poikilothermic, cold-blooded, and regulated by the external environment. And amphibians, the frogs, they are poikilothermic and ectothermic. So They are governed by the external environment. And some reptiles and most of the invertebrates, they are ectothermic and phyclothermic. Hope with this I have made the point clear. I have made the point clear. There are 4 terms here: endothermic animals, internal regulators; ectothermic animals, external regulators; then again homeothermic, regulated properly; and phyclothermic, unregulated. Warm, or otherwise in the loose words, warm-blooded animals and cold-blooded animals. Okay, so now move on. Here are some beautiful examples or beautiful pictures of the endotherms and ectotherms. You have this puppy here. So this is one of the endothermic animal with homeothermic regulation. This is a vertebrate and a mammal, and this is the one. And this is a ectothermic homeothermic animals. This is in the deep sea. This fish is seen in the deep sea, and this is a regulated homeothermic, but it is in the ectotherm. And in the phyclothermic endotherms, squirrel is here. It goes for hibernation. This hibernation is regulated depending upon the season. The regulation of the internal regulators for the hibernation, but it's a cold blood. It will change the body temperature at that point in time. You have the ectothermic, the external environment. Here is a frog, so that is the ectothermic animal, which is cold-blooded, that is phyclothermic. Okay, with these examples, we move on to further. So what is the body temperature, the normal body temperature in human beings? Nowadays, if you happen to come to AMSR now, every day you will be scanned for your body temperature, because we enter the college when they will take our body temperature by that is infrared gadget. So they will record my body temperature, then allow me inside. So that means what is the normal body temperature? So the normal body temperature in the human is a core temperature or internal temperature is around 37 degrees Celsius. In fact, it will be around 98.6 degree Fahrenheit. Most of our the clinical thermometers, what we call as clinical thermometers, are graduated for the Fahrenheit. Of course, there are 2 scales. You will find the 2 scales on either side of this thing. But whenever as a doctor we say that he's having a 99 degrees, his temperature is 100 degrees, he's running, and 102 degrees, 103 degrees, something like that we say. Those we are referring to the Fahrenheit scale, not the Celsius. The Celsius 100 degrees is a boiling point. So the matter does not exist at that point of time. The human being cannot be alive. So that means we have these units, and we usually use this Fahrenheit scale for our temperature. Anyway, but if you are using it at 37 the centigrade Celsius scale, so the Celsius would be around 43 degrees Celsius. It will be very severe, very high temperature for our existence. Now, it is very crucial. The temperature regulation is very crucial for our survival. Without the regulation, human body would not be able to adequately function, and will inevitably expire. Say, for example, I am going to Himalaya, I am staying there, and if there is no body temperature regulating mechanism, whole of my body will cool down, and once it cools down, I will be frozen. I will be frozen like any other matter. So, but I will not be frozen because of the regulation. My blood will not freeze. The blood will be warm, maintained at 37 degrees Celsius. The core temperature is most accurately measured via the rectal probe thermometer. So the normal, the core temperature, when we are talking about it, is the rectal temperature. This is the temperature at which the human body systems work together at their optimum. So that means the core temperature tells about what is the exact internal temperature. But sometimes it is rather difficult to have the rectal probe thermometer. So can you imagine what these the whatever in the airport or in other areas, what they do? They just hit that scan or the infrared scanner there, then they detect the temperature. So now what they are doing, they are detecting some temperature of the blood flowing through this thing and through the infrared detector systems, and it will be surface temperature, which is not even the core temperature. Okay. Anyway, I will come back to that after some time. Now let us move further. So now, how we record the temperature in a patient? That is our question. We have four important routes in which we measure the temperature. One, we record the auxiliary temperature. You place the clinical thermometer in the axillary fold and then wait for a particular period, maybe 1 minute or more, or to get equilibrated, and you record the temperature. But the temperature recorded here is much less, is lesser than what the core temperature. This is the core temperature, 37.2 degrees Celsius, the rectal temperature. You just see that it is about 1 degree less than the core temperature. Then we can record the temperature by placing a clinical thermometer in the mouth, sublingually, underneath this tongue. And when you record the temperature, the normal range of the temperature, because you have to keep it there for a while so that the temperature increases, or the bulb takes up this thing, and then after nowadays we have those electronic gadgets wherein they may give beep, and then you can know the temperature. You can read the temperature either digitally, or you can read the temperature through the mercury. So now what's happening here? This temperature is slightly lesser than the core temperature. Rectal temperature I consider as a core temperature. Sometimes besides the rectal temperature, the vaginal temperature is also recorded in some individuals, but that becomes really difficult. The rectal temperature is taken by introducing a probe. So now this rectal temperature is taken as a core here, and you just see that it is about 0.5 degrees lesser than the oral temperature is 0.5 degrees lesser than the rectal temperature. Here, though I have shown only 0.2 degrees, you can go down maybe 36.8 or 36.7, maybe the temperature here in this situation. Now, the problem with oral temperature. Say, for example, if I have a hot coffee before visiting you as a doctor, and you ask your nurse or your assistant to record my temperature, and naturally my oral temperature is high because I have just taken a hot cup of a coffee, and that would increase the temperature much more than what is recorded here. So that is one of the things. Or before coming to you, I had eaten some nice lovely ice cream or a cold stuff, then also the temperature may go down. So that means this oral temperature, you have to have a certain amount of control, and you see that he settles down and he has not consumed the hot or cold drinks, and then you record the temperature for a period of time. Then we have a rectal temperature, insert the probe into the rectum and record the temperature. This is the gold standard. This is the standard internal core temperature, and that would be around 37 degrees Celsius or 37.2 degrees Celsius. That indicates the environment of whatever is there in the viscera or the internal organs. Now, there is another place wherein we can record the temperature, what is called a tympanic temperature or intraoral temperature. Intraoral, you insert that thermometer probe into the auditory canal and record that temperature. Now, so there were preferences at times because the intraoral temperature is that temperature which is close to the hypothalamus. You can just imagine that it's close to the hypothalamus. This is the temperature happening near the hypothalamus. So now this temperature is similar to the core temperature. It's similar to the core temperature, and but the problem with the intraoral is you may anytime rupture the tympanic membrane. So inexperience may do a harm, rather rectal temperature may be a beneficial one. Just I'm giving how the temperature is recorded and what is the various the temperature levels at a different point. This is as a clinical person, you need to know about it and how you use it. Then coming back, this is one of the diagram I have taken from the Genong. You just see that it's a recording of a oral temperature in a hospitalized patient who was not having any fever, who did not have a fever. So this green one, this person is going up and down and up and down and up and down. So look at that. So that means this lower point, this is the normal range. That means there is a fluctuation of the temperature. Say, for example, it is 37.2 here, maybe 36.5 or 36.4 there. So that means nearly about 1 degree fluctuation, 1 degree or 0.8 degrees Celsius fluctuation of the temperature in the daytime. So that means it's the day 2, day 3. You can just see that these cycles are going, these cyclically these are happening. So that means the temperature when you are recording, you have to mention at what time in the day you are recording the temperature. Say, for example, if I am recording the temperature in the evening hours, what do you expect in the evening hours? Naturally, because of your activity, all other external means, you have gained the temperature. The temperature is somewhere here. This is the evening temperature. Now, if you record the temperature, this is the morning temperature, early morning temperature around 6 o'clock. So that means there is, as you go to sleep, your activity diminishes. You go to the metabolism decreases, and you will go to the minimum activity, the minimal basal metabolic rate, and you have the lowest temperature. So that means the highest temperature is recorded in the evening hours, and the lowest temperature is recorded in the early morning hours. So that means you have to, it is necessary to keep the temperature chart of a patient when in the hospitals. You must have seen those temperature charts are maintained regularly by the nursing staff. Okay, so now having seen this, that means the fluctuations are normal, and these fluctuations we should see. If there is no fluctuation, that means there is some abnormality in the regulatory mechanism, because these fluctuations are the indicating the normal regulatory activity of the temperature, and here it is a oral temperature. Okay, so now here just I wanted to say, in the hyperthyroid states, these are at a higher level. These regulatory things are happening at a higher level. In the hypothyroid patients, you see that these are happening at a lower level. So that means it operates at the lower range, it operates at the higher range. What does it indicate? It indicates that the level of activity in increased thyroid activity is set at a different plane. It operates at a different plane. It operates at a different plane. So when I talk about the set point, you will try to understand that. So that means there is normally our body temperature is set at particular level, and this operates within that range. The range is going with that. Here it is set at a different level, different lower level. Here in the hypothyroid state, it is at lower level, and in the hyperthyroid state, it is at higher level. Okay, now we move on. So I mentioned about the temperatures in various areas of our body. Sorry. So now the rectal temperature remains fairly constant. This is the calorimetric temperature. So you can just see that of the subject. You can just see it is happening straight. The head, it is a little lesser, maybe 34 degrees Celsius, 34 degrees Celsius. So slightly increases. Okay, as it is subjected to various ambient temperature in a calorimeter. So that means it is measured with some other instrument. So now in case of a trunk, the temperature is still lower, maybe at 33. Then skin temperature is 32 degrees. The hands, that is the extremities, you just see that it is somewhere between 29 and 30. And the feet, it is much lower, maybe 25 degrees Celsius. But of course, these are measurements. You don't worry about this component. But if you are looking at this, so that means when you are measuring the temperature, so the head temperature is more near to the core temperature. The remaining parts, the temperature are lesser. It all depends upon the radiation, convection, and vaporization levels. And this is again taken from the Genong. Now we move on. So the body temperature variations. I have just listed them. So the variations happen daily basis. I have already mentioned the diurnal variations, low in the morning, peak in the evening. So that means it reaches maximum in the evening and the lowest in the morning. Okay, so that is the diurnal variation. In between, you have that cyclical. You just see that the cyclical. This is the evening hour. This is the morning hour. So again, the evening hour. This cyclical things goes on. Okay, then ovulation. So the temperature increases. The basal, what we call it as a basal body temperature, is an indicator of the ovulation. So when the ovulation happens, the body temperature rises by 5 degrees Celsius and may remain at that level in the entire secretory phase or in the progestational phase. The mechanism or the causative factor for this increased temperature is one of the metabolites of the progesterone. Ethiocalinolene is one of the compound which is released by the metabolism of the progesterone, increases the body temperature, sensitizes the hypothalamic areas to keep the set point at a higher level so that the body temperature increases. So there is an increase in the basal body temperature. Whereas estrogen sets it back. That means a calorigenic effect of that particular hormone or a chemical. Now in children, the temperature is higher than the adults, maybe 0.5 degrees. So when we are considering, when we are talking about the fever, suppose if a person is there, if a child is there and he is having a 37.9 or a 38 degrees Celsius, maybe he is normal. Say you are taking in the evening hours, he has consulted you in the evening hours, he has played and he has a lot of, his metabolic activity is higher than the adults. So that in that situation, the temperature is a little higher up there. So you can see that. Similarly, in case if you take between the male-female differences, the temperature may be higher in the males where metabolism is higher. In case of infants, the problem is they do not have the well-established regulatory center, the temperature regulatory centers. It's not developed yet. It is developing. Just a newborn baby. It has not developed, and the hypothalamus is trying to develop. In that case, the temperature regulation is not happening the way you like. So now, in the infants or in the first year of life, it's regulated because a sweating mechanism is not operative, and other mechanisms are even the sympathetic or autonomic mechanisms are not operative in that situation. So the another important thermogenetic factor, that is a brown adipose tissue. The brown adipose tissue comes into effect and it releases a extra amount of energy, extra amount of heat. That is a brown adipose tissue. These infants are having a more brown adipose tissue to the surface area than the adults. So that means that adds to the heat generating mechanism. Now coming back here, the exercise and activity that increases the temperature on one, because of the muscle contraction itself. Because of the muscle contraction, there is an enormous amount of heat is released. what is called a fan effect. During a muscle contraction, the energy is released, and this energy, some amount of heat is generated, and that is adding to the body heat, the metabolism. Of course, there is a synthesis and the metabolism and catabolism going on. The second thing, the activity increases during the exercise, and this activity further adds to the heat. Then in the exercise, there is a release of hormones like adrenaline and growth hormone, thyroxine, and a number of heat regulating hormones are released. So you get the increased body temperature after exercise. But anyway, you cool down in relation to time. Now, similarly, emotions. Suppose emotions, you have positive emotions and negative emotions. So say, for example, here I mentioned about positive emotions. That means you are anxious, you are stressed up, and your muscle tone is more, and more heat is produced, more temperature. Similarly, because of the anxiety, you have those adrenergic system activated, and you have the temperature, higher temperature. So that means you have the increased muscle tone and you have the increased adrenergic activity. And your body temperature increases after a meal. After a meal, you will have a increased body temperature. And this increased body temperature after meal is more than expected for sometimes because of some food elements or the food components of the diet. They will produce more heat, especially the protein diet. If you are consuming a protein rich diet, suppose if one is consuming a protein rich diet and another is consuming the carbohydrate rich diet, in the person who has consumed a protein rich diet, his body temperature increases higher, and this part of the increased calorigenesis by the food is known as a specific dynamic action of a food. So especially the proteins, so they will release or they will somehow produce more energy. So maybe because of the activation of the enzyme systems, or maybe because of some thermoregulatory aspects generated by the proteins. So that is a specific dynamic action. This is a short note question. You think about that. Then, so you have increased automatically, because when I start consuming food, there is a masticatory activity, and the entire swallowing, the stomach activity, the intestinal activity, and all those things, the total GIT activity is enhanced. That would add to the body temperature. So these are the variations of the body temperature because of the activity. Now coming back here, so now heat production and heat loss. Let us understand heat production and heat loss. Now the heat, whatever, before we consider this aspect, we take up this issue, the physical means, so that we as an object in this universe, we are as a matter in this universe. If we are, our body is a matter, this matter receives the external, or receives or gives away the heat by these three physical means: the conduction, convection, and radiation. That conduction means transfers heat from the next area, or the molecules move around. That convection, or the radiation, or radiate heat, or take up the cold, whatever it happens. It is applicable for both the sides, that is either a cold or a heat environment. These three things by physical means would change the temperature of the matter. I'm considering the body as a matter, and if you consider the body as a matter, these physical things would apply. That is one aspect. That means in the hot summer, I gain heat by these things, by the external environment. So now, what is body heat? This is one aspect. So that is how I gain heat. Suppose I am sitting in an air-conditioned chamber like that, and where all the time the air conditioner is working. That means it cools down. That means I am getting it the radiation and the convection molecules. They are coming up and they will cool down my body because my body is a matter. So now coming back here, what are the body heat is produced by these three primary mechanisms. That is the metabolic process, the basic metabolic process in our body. So that means even at rest also we generate calories, or it is necessary for the survival. All the cellular functions they generate calories, maybe 39 to 40 kilocalories per kg per hour. So that is the amount of heat we generate even at rest. Even at rest. So now maybe it is a little lesser in case of females, and this type of that generation of the body. This is in reference to the body surface area. So we have those basal metabolic processes. That means if I repeat again, I just made a 39 to 40 kilocalories per hour per square meter of our body. I said per kg per square meter of the body. So that is where we generate the heat even at rest without any activity. If you add the activity, that enhances it depending upon the strength of the activity or the magnitude of the activity. So then this is a basal metabolic process. Then food intake, I have already mentioned the specific dynamic action of the food and even the GIT activity. The muscular activity, depending upon proportional to the muscle activity, that increases. These are the factors which produce heat. These are the factors which are producing it. And so here are the factors here in the bottom which lose heat. So that means we lose heat because of the radiation and conduction, because our body temperature, if suppose if lose heat means if the external temperature is lower than the body temperature, then we tend to lose. Suppose if the external temperature is 50 degrees Celsius, we are going to gain the heat. So it is just reverse. So though it is mentioned here, the percentage of heat loss at 21 degrees Celsius, that is the temperature that is mentioned. Suppose if I am sitting at a 50 degrees in the whatever the environment, then what I may gain heat from these means. Okay, the radiation or conduction, they will usually in the normal body, we are staying in home or in a domesticated person, we will lose heat by these processes, physical processes, radiation or conduction. And we will lose heat by the sweating mechanism. Sweating mechanism, because of the what the sweat is a water, this water layer that cools down the surface, and there is even the latent heat of the cooling. It produces the cooling because of the vaporization, and that would lose the heat, or that would produce the loss of heat. That's nearly about 27 degree, 27%, 27% in a normal individuals. So that means it's a good loss. It's a very good loss that by sweating mechanism, especially when we are exposed to very high heat stress mechanisms. So then by respiration, that means constantly we are expiring the hot air out. So that means warm air. I'm not telling the hot air, warm air out, because when I'm expiring, the warm air comes and we lose about 2% of the body percentage loss of the heat. And by passing urine and by passing stools, that is a urination and defecation, we lose some amount of heat, and that constitutes about 1%. So that means the major loss of heat is coming from the physical means, radiation or conduction, that is 70%, provided you are at a 21 degrees Celsius. Suppose if you are 40 degrees Celsius, no, there is no loss of heat. There is a gain in the heat, and this gain in the heat has to be compensated by something else. So those are the regulatory aspects. Now, the endocrine aspects of which regulate or which are involved in the heat regulation are the thyroid hormones, adrenal medullary hormones and sympathetics, growth hormone, androgens, and progesterone. These are the hormones which increase the heat production. Of course, you cannot isolate, but they are primarily they produce the increase the activity, or whatever is producing the increased ATP synthesis that would increase the heat production. Now coming back, what is the temperature regulating mechanism? We try to see it. It is a reflex and semi-reflex responses in our body. And these reflex and semi-reflex mechanisms work on autonomic activity, that is the sympathetic and parasympathetic system, somatic activity, that is the muscular activity, and endocrine activity, I have already mentioned about that, or behavioral changes. All these things are put together, they will try to have the regulation or maintenance of the temperature. Now, if you are looking at the regulation, what is this regulation is all about? Actually, regulation is a, a system in which heat loss and heat gain are equalized. So that means our body tries to balance the heat loss or heat gain mechanism so that they are kept at one level, so that it works at 37 degrees Celsius. That is exactly is that. So that means the balance between, suppose if I am gaining more heat, I should have more heat loss mechanism should be activated, and if I am gaining heat, I should lose. If I am losing heat, I should gain. That is how the balance is maintained. This balance is the main regulatory phenomena. This balance happens through the autonomic activity, somatic activity, endocrine activity, and behavioral changes. Now, for heat gain, so that means if there is heat has to be gained in our body, so that means there should be two mechanisms. One, increased production of the heat, whatever the means by which the heat is generated, that is a calorigenesis or a heat production, or decreased loss of a heat. Increased production and decreased loss would produce the heat gain. In the other way, heat loss is because of the increased cooling, that is a heat loss mechanism, and decreased heat gain mechanisms. So that means you have to consider these two aspects, that means we have a heater and a cooler, and balance between the heater and cooler working together, that either maintain the heat gain or heat loss mechanisms. When something happens, one has to have a reciprocal relation in which they will try to balance. That is the one aspect. Now moving further, so these are the heat gain mechanisms. What are the various heat gain mechanisms in our body? So that means these are heating mechanisms in our body. One is shivering. Shivering is a involuntary muscle contraction. So it's like this. So you're doing like this. So that means there is involuntary muscle contraction. This shivering generates an enormous amount of heat. So that with the skeletal muscle contraction, this is governed by the increased somatic activity, but the increased activity is governed by the hypothalamus. That is one aspect. That means increased. It's an involuntary shivering mechanism. The voluntary activity, say for example, increased voluntary activity. Suppose you are doing an exercise, you are doing some activity, you are running. So then also the heat production is there. That is another thing. So this is the involuntary, this is a voluntary activity of the skeletal muscles. Then we have hunger. Hunger means that means if you are hungry, you take the food. The food is having a specific dynamic action, and that would produce extra heat. So that means that would produce the heat. So that means consumption of a food increases the heat production, because that involves the specific dynamic action, and also the involves the visceral activity, increased visceral activity along with the somatic activity. Now, the increased secretion of norepinephrine and epinephrine, that would increase, because increased secretion of norepinephrine and epinephrine, that would increase the shivering or even tremors, and that would sensitize the activity, make the activity powerful, and they themselves increase the activity of the all cellular systems, especially the adipose tissue and other tissues for the glucose breakdown and more ATP generation. That is happening. That is a norepinephrine and epinephrine. So they will increase the blood pressure. You become tense. The muscle tone is increased, so on. So that would produce the heat gain. Now, coming back, decreased heat loss. So that means decreased heat loss mechanism. That means this heat gain is if loss is decreased, it's a gain. So that means whatever the heat loss mechanism, the sweating and other mechanisms are there, if they are decreased, there is a heat gain mechanism. So that is associated with a cutaneous vasoconstriction. If the blood vessels are vasoconstricted, so that means there is a sweating is not taking place, and that would produce the heat gain. So that means that would increase and along with that, even the piloerector muscles, are activated. This whatever the piloerector muscles, what is called a horripilation or a goosebumps, what we consider. So these are because of the increased adrenergic activity that would produce the contraction of these involuntary muscles, which are controlling the hair follicles, and hair follicles become erect, and that would produce the heat. And another behavioral change is a curling up. So that means if I'm reducing the surface area, that means I am just trying to have my all these things, so that increases the heat gain mechanism, curling up position. The behavior, suppose in the behavior, what are the good behavior for production of the heat? So that means I want to wear full clothes. I want to have a one blanket, two blanket, or razai, what we call it or a blanket in North India, razai, that is thick razai, wherein they enter into. That means there is a behavioral. So that means a clothing pattern. So you like to have a jacket, coat, or some very warm woolen clothings, so they will increase so there is a preference for your clothing. So that means you want to have a tie and all those full sleeves, so on so forth. That is also clothing pattern is behavioral. So that means it will change, because you may like to wear all those things because of the external environment. So increased consumption of the food and the type of the food. You have a preferences for a particular type of food. Maybe you may want to go for a food which is fried, crunchy, and the protein rich, so that it increases the heat production. And you hear the activity, the behavior is another behavior is activity. You want to go for a sports activity, you want to run, and you want to have for a fun picnic, so on, and you want to go to the open field to get the sunlight and to increase the temperature. So these are the behavioral things which are happening, and already the curling up is there, the posture. That means you have to have this thing, and you are also seeking for some the warm places, and you go there and you try to be associated with those warm places. So that is what the heat gain mechanisms. Similarly, in the other side, the heat loss mechanisms. That means this heat loss mechanism is because of the cutaneous vasodilatation. The cutaneous vasodilatation, the more blood is flowing, there is evaporation of the sweating mechanism is activated, the more blood is there in the periphery. So that means it allows the dissipation of the heat, internal heat. And sweating adds further because of the activation of the cholinergic sympathetic fibers. The sweating take place, and that would cool down the surface. And this would activate the respiration. Respiration is increased. If more and more respiration, if I breathe out more and more loss, more heat loss, so that is cools down. Especially panting. Panting is one of those in animals like cats and dogs. The panting is one of the major source of heat loss. So that is a panting mechanism. That is a respiration. The decreased heat production. So that means decreased heat production. That is, these are whatever the production from the body is decreased, the metabolism is decreased. So that means you are going to cool down and it's not activated. So now there is a what is called a decreased appetite and decreased hunger, anorexia. Anorexia is a decreased hunger or appetite. So that would decrease the food intake, and there is a food intake, decreased food intake, decreased heat production. So then you will be inert. That is a behavioral thing. You don't want to go out. You want to lazy out. You just want to lie down under the fan. These are the behavior under the fan, and trying to have a minimal clothing. Minimal clothing. You want to go to a swimming pool, and you want to have a cold food, cold drinks, ice cream, so on. So these are some food preferences what we have for the heat loss mechanisms. These are behavioral abnormalities which are associated with the limbic system. And activity preferences, that means you don't want to be inactive, you don't want to be active, you don't want to run in the, so that means you want to isolate, and you want to go to a place where there is a nice cool environment, and then you want to sit there cozily. And posture also, you want to just it's not curling, it's open up, the whole body surface area is exposed for the loss of heat. So that is the heat loss mechanism. Now what are the hypothalamic centers for the thermoregulation? I want to mention here one heating unit in the hypothalamus, the cooling unit in the hypothalamus, and the regulating unit set point, that is the thermostat. Posterior hypothalamus, it is as a heating unit. So that means it regulates the heat gain mechanisms, or it will activate the heat gain mechanisms. It produces the heat. It is as a heater. Anterior hypothalamus is a cooler, so that this cools down. Then we have connecting between the anterior hypothalamus and posterior hypothalamus is these two are talking to this preoptic area. This is the point where it regulates which one to be operated, whether heating unit is to be operated or a cooling unit is to be operated. There is a thermostat, and this thermostat works for a set point. Now coming back here, so if what happens, because there are some in decerebrate animal, what happens to the thermoregulation? It is seen that in decerebrate animals, thermoregulation still persists, and especially the thermoregulation against heat still occurs even in decerebrate. Decerebrate means hypothalamus is out, hypothalamus is not there, and that means even at the neural things without hypothalamus, without diencephalon, we have those things in the hindbrain and the medulla pons. They are regulating, probably whatever regulating the sympathetic autonomic system, they are operating here. So these are one of the things, but we don't know exactly how they are. Maybe the spontaneous activity. Now coming back here, I told about the anterior hypothalamus is a cooling unit. Now what happens if I increase the activity of the cooling unit? That is a stimulation. Stimulation causes a cutaneous vasodilatation and sweating mechanisms. By doing so, that will be a loss of heat. There is a loss of heat. So that means the cooling unit is operative very well. So now if the cooling unit fails, or it is cut off, if that is the thing, lesions of the anterior hypothalamus produce hyperthermia because there is no cooling. Heat accumulates. The heat keeps on, calories keep on accumulating. This produces hyperthermia, and the rectal temperatures rose up to 43 degrees Celsius, 109 degree point. This is not viable at this point. It's not existing for life, because anything above 104 degree Fahrenheit or 105 degree Fahrenheit, it is a hyperthermia, and it is not viable for life. So that means it becomes fatal. So we have to be very careful. So look at this here, nearly 109 degree Fahrenheit. It's too much, and a person might have died by this time. That is because of hyperthermia. So that's coming back here. What happens to this heating unit? Suppose if I stimulate the heating unit, so it will produce the severing and the other heat gain mechanisms. So I have mentioned about all of the heating mechanisms. They will be activated. And if I cut off this heating unit, or if I produce lesions there, that would produce a hypothermia. So here it produced hyperthermia. Here it produces the cool. That means the temperature falls below 35 degrees Celsius, so maybe falls below maybe 85, 90 degree or 87 degree Fahrenheit. So that becomes very cool, and that's again not compatible with life. Now, coming back here, so we are looking at a point. What is this preoptic areas and the set point in this preoptic area? Usually, normally our body temperature is set at 37 degrees Celsius, which is happening at the preoptic area. It is like a thermostat unit which works in your heating geyser in our bathroom. In the bathroom, what happens? You switch on. When you switch on, the heater is on, or the heating coil is on, and that produces or increases the temperature of the water. And once the water temperature reaches to a particular level, it turns off. And when you take some water, then it again, because the entry of the new cold water, so it will cool down, and then again it turns on. So that means the preoptic area is that thermostat. So here is it is set at a 37 degrees Celsius, and the elevation of the set point, we feel it as a fever. That means that would produce, that means if it is 37 degrees Celsius, and if it is set at a 39 degrees Celsius, that means whole thing is working for to keep it for 39 degrees Celsius, because it is the new thing is happening. So that is what is fever. And this elevation of the set point may happen because of certain of these elements. So maybe what are called pyrogens, the fever producing chemicals, the pyrogens. These pyrogens may be external, may be internal. These externals are coming from the organism. So now we have a COVID-19 there. So these are the organisms. They produce the exogenous pyrogens, or exogenous pyrogens. In also they will activate the endogenous the polymorphonuclear cells and the monocytes to release those endogenous substances. So these both the endogenous and exogenous pyrogens, and these are nothing but the cytokines. They will be released and they will produce the fever, and they will then activate the hypothalamic centers to secrete the prostaglandins, and that prostaglandin takes care. I will just explain this thing little later. So then again, so there is, the electrolytes also maintain the set point. So that means calcium is one of them and sodium is the other. Calcium sodium balance is an important function for the set point of the hypothalamus in the preoptic area. So suppose if there is a lowering of the set point, so then what happens? It will activate the cooling unit. If it is activating the cooling unit, the body temperatures come down, and the person feels more cold. So this may happen. Elevation of the set point may happen in case of the hyperthyroidism. Lowering of the set point may happen in the hypothyroidism. I have shown that in the hyperthyroidism it is happening at a upper level, and in hypothyroidism it is happening at the lower level. So that itself it indicates the set point alteration. Now coming back with the fever. Fever is an increased heat production and a decreased heat loss, both. So now, if this is the increased body temperature, it is happening because of the elevation of the set point. This elevation of the set point is brought about by the endogenous prostaglandins in the preoptic area. The prostaglandins in the preoptic area, they will elevate the temperature at a higher level. And these prostaglandins in turn are activated by the cytokines, that is TNF alpha and all those interleukins. They will activate, which are released from the monocytes, macrophages, and even polymorphonuclear leukocytes and Cooper cells. So these will activate these cytokines, and that would increase the all these cytokines and endogenous substances they will produce. These are nothing but the pyrogens. And the other toxins, endotoxins, or inflammation, endotoxin or cell damage, which happens in case of inflammation, other pyrogenic stimulation, the bacterial pyrogens, bacterial invasion, viral invasion, or there are certain bacteria, they secrete a lipopolysaccharide, what is called this lipopolysaccharide, and all those things are pyrogens. They will activate these cells, the immunological cells, the monocytes, the macrophages, and Cooper cells, and they will increase cytokines. They will release prostaglandins from the preoptic area and increase set the point at higher level, and the person feels fever. Once he feels fever, that means he feels cold because the set point is at higher level. Now, if the set point is at 39 degrees Celsius or 40 degrees Celsius, all my body mechanisms work to generate heat. So that is why he will get rigors and chills. He feels cold and he gets the rigors. So the rigors is nothing but an involuntary skeletal muscle contraction which will generate heat, because the set point is elevated. All the heat production unit is activated. So if the heat production unit is activated and heat loss unit is suppressed, so more heat is produced and his body temperature increases. And so once, what happens in case of this, if you block this prostaglandins, that's what we do by giving a prostaglandin synthase inhibitor. So what are your antipyretics? Your antipyretics are nothing but the prostaglandin synthase inhibitors. They were paracetamol or aspirin. They block this the prostaglandin synthesis, and in that case they will bring back the set point to the normal, to the 37 degrees Celsius. Once it comes back, what happens? The person he will cool, because suddenly there is an enormous amount of sweating, heat loss mechanism sets in, and he cools down. As long as there's prostaglandins are suppressed. Once prostaglandin is again resuming, the whole thing again, the fever comes in, because as long as the effect of the paracetamol or the effect of the aspirin persists, it happens. So that means that is one important aspect about these drugs. Now, I am asking one important question: whether we want to have fever. What is this fever? Fever is a protective response. By increasing the body temperature, it will try to kill, or it will try to kill these organisms which are producing. They will try to reduce the activity. So it is a protective mechanism. So sudden cooling down is also not useful because what you are doing, if you cool down, you are trying to help these things to flare up, or trying to progress or proliferate. So under that circumstances, it is better to have, you should not control it so much. Some amount of fever is a protective mechanism. Now move on to further. This is the summary of the entire chart. I will start here. Here is the summer, the increased body temperature, temperature sensitive receptors in skin and hypothalamus, they are activated. Once they are activated, you have these voluntary responses. What happens? Because of the heat, reduced activity. Because of the heat, you want to have the cold drink, cold food and ice cream. And because of the heat, you want to have a minimal clothing. Because of heat, you want to go to the cold environment. So these are some voluntary responses. Now what happens here? It comes to the brain, and in the brain, the thermostat in the hypothalamus is activating the cooling mechanisms. So now these cooling mechanisms, usually the parasympathetic activity. The parasympathetic activity is producing the sweating. Sweating produces the increased heat loss. that is on 2 count. And here it increases the sympathetic activities, it inhibits the sympathetic activity. Inhibition of the sympathetic activity produces the vasodilatation. Vasodilatation produces the heat loss because the cutaneous surfaces. Now, because decreased sympathetic activity decreases the metabolic rate, and decreases the metabolic rate decreases the heat gain. That is how it tries to balance. This is one aspect. I'm trying to see the summer of Chittur here, and that is how we try to operate. Now, coming back here in the winter, I'm in the Himalayan glaciers. My body temperature decreases. When the body temperature decreases, the temperature sensitive skin receptors and the hypothalamus are activated. So now what happens here? The voluntary response is you would like to have more food. You are hungry. Your appetite is increased. You eat more food, more specific dynamic action, more heat is produced, and increased activity. You want to run around and you want to do activity. You don't, and even if you are doing, there is an involuntary muscle activity, muscle tone is increased, and even some amount of rigors are there. And you want to prefer for a warm clothing, warm woolen clothing, and you want to have a bonfire and sit in the heat in front of the heater to get the warm effect. And this is the heat source there, and that is what your voluntary response is. This is behavioral. Now coming back to the hypothalamus, what the hypothalamus does, so now it will set it activates the thermostats for producing the warming, that is the heater. It turns on the heater, warming mechanisms. In this warming mechanisms, one is the endocrine mechanism. This increases the thyroid gland activity, increases the thyroid gland activity, increases the metabolic rates, and that generates the heat. And this again, thermostat activates the sympathetic activity. Sympathetic activity increases the metabolic rate, and it produces the vasoconstriction. That means it prevents the heat loss. And that it produces the piloerection I was talking about. So this piloerection, one, increases the metabolism, and also it traps the air and insulates. So that means that is how it happens. And it also activates the shivering mechanism that generates the heat. So these are the two things. This entire particular chart will give you all that, and it is taken from Hutchison's clinical methods. This entire figure, and it gives the entire thermoregulatory mechanism in one place. So it is totally summarized. Okay, now coming back here, these are the keywords for today's: heat gain mechanisms, heat loss mechanisms, sweating, specific dynamic action, anterior hypothalamus, posterior hypothalamus, preoptic area, thermostat, thermal set point, the fever, piloerection, prostaglandins in fever, pyrogens, cytokines and fever, exposure to cold, exposure to heat. So these are some of the keywords. I want that you write short notes on all these keywords. So you try to answer the questions. You make a paragraph each for all that, and that would cover up the entire your thermoregulatory mechanism. Now coming back, next class, what I will do, I will talk about the physiology of feeding and satiety. Okay, so now that would cover, and besides that, Hutchison Hunter's clinical medicine, I have referred to Guyton's and Genong's. Mostly I have taken it from Genong and Kendall's textbook of neuroscience. Thank you so much. Maybe tomorrow we will look into, tomorrow means next week we will go for the next chapter.